Thank you, Kristen. I am Dennis DeYoung, and I am a business relations specialist here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities. And again, I'd just like to welcome everybody to the first Accessibility Hour with OOD. I'm excited this morning that I get to host this presentation with my colleague, Julie Woods. Julie is our worksite accessibility specialist. Julie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, Dennis, thank you. It's great to be presenting with you today as well. And hello to everyone who is joining us virtually. We are certainly happy you're here today. My name is Julie Wood. I'm an occupational therapist working in the role of worksite accessibility specialist here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities. You may be familiar that we have been putting on a virtual webinar each month of the pandemic since May, and so the Accessibility Hour is really just a continuation of that series. But for October, we wanted to do something different from talking in depth about one topic and instead answer some of the common questions that we receive from employers.
Thank you, Julie. And also, I did want to point out that this Accessibility Hour is our way of celebrating October as being the National Disability Employment Awareness Month, or NDAM. And this year is particularly special as it is both the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as the 75th anniversary of NDAM. NDAM was created to celebrate the contributions of workers with disabilities, as well as educate about the value of a workforce inclusive of their skills and talents. Julie, so what topics are we going to cover today?
Well, Dennis, what we did is review the questions we received in advance and then organize those into topics. So we will be talking about service animals, face coverings, Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is referred to as the ADA. We will talk about reasonable accommodations and being an inclusive employer. So first of all, thank you to everyone who submitted questions for today's Accessibility Hour, and we will answer as many questions as we can. In addition, we will pause a few times to take live questions, and then we also have additional content to answer these common questions in the learner's guide that accompanies this training. We've also included our contact information, so if you leave today with a question that has yet to be answered, please reach out to us because we are very happy to answer all of your questions.
Great. And before we get started, I do want to share a couple of the resources that we have made available. If you haven't been able to attend any of our live training series, those are available in archived versions, and they are available on the employers page of the OOD website. Each includes a fact sheet and a learner's guide. And today's training, Accessibility Hour, will include the PowerPoint slides that you are viewing now. In addition, there is a learner's guide with a couple of fact sheets, one on service animals and one on working with deaf and hard of hearing employees. And there will also be a link posted in the Q&A section in Microsoft Teams to all of these resources. Just as a reminder, the information we share in these resources and during today's conversation is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice. But we do hope this information is helpful for you. And again, I just want to remind everybody, we are dedicated to answering all of your questions, or as many of your questions as we can get to today. So please, as the presentation goes on, put your questions in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And with that, let's start with our first topic. One of the areas that we get a lot of questions is on service animals. Many of us see service animals in the public and in the community and might not know what service animals are used for in the workplace. Julie, specifically, one of our employees asked, what kinds of tasks do service animals perform for employees with disabilities at work?
That's a great place to start, Dennis, is with understanding how a service animal performs a task for an employee with a disability. And so there's actually a variety of ways that a service animal can be trained to do that. So let me just share a few of those. First, a service animal could be trained to provide stability for an employee with a physical disability that might limit balance and walking. More commonly, we may be familiar with service animals being trained to provide navigation guidance for an employee who is blind or has low vision. A service animal could be trained to alert a deaf or hard of hearing employee to the sounds of the work environment. And so that could be the sound of a coworker approaching the workstation from behind, or it could include the alarms that are in the work environment. And a service animal could also be trained to provide a sense of calm for an employee with an anxiety disorder.
So Julie, is a service animal a form of a reasonable accommodation?
Kind of. So we know reasonable accommodation is required under Title I of the ADA, and that is enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is referred to as the EEOC. So the EEOC has a published guidance on reasonable accommodation, and in that guidance, they do not address service animals as their own standalone category of reasonable accommodation. And that's because the animal itself is not the accommodation. It's the use of the service animal that requires a reasonable accommodation. And so it's likely that as an employer, you have a no animal policy, and that would need to be modified to permit the animal to be in the work environment. And so modifying that policy is the reasonable accommodation. Another accommodation you may consider making is providing the employee who is using the service animal a flexible schedule so he can take breaks as needed to take care of the animal, because the animal is going to have needs throughout the workday to go outside or have access to food and water. And then another example of an accommodation you might consider is to provide a private office for the employee who is using the service animal in case you encounter that scenario where another coworker has an allergy to the animal and you want to keep these two employees separate to manage both needs.
That makes sense. So Julie, one of the questions we received is about therapy and comfort animals. Are these the same as service animals, and are they permitted in the workplace?
Actually, each of these animals has their own definition and their own purpose. So the answer is no, they're not all the same. And again, I'm speaking from a Title I perspective of the ADA, not from a Title II or Title III perspective. Those titles impact bringing service animals into public places. And so those aspects of the ADA do have specific definitions and specific rules. And so I've included resources in the learner's guide for those of you that may have responsibilities under Titles II and III. But again, from a Title I perspective, which addresses employment and reasonable accommodation, just like with service animals, the EEOC does not address therapy or comfort animals as their own standalone categories of accommodations. And so really you would just address all of these animals the same and consider them, the use of them as a form of reasonable accommodation.
Great. So whether it's a service animal, a therapy animal, or a comfort animal, who takes care of the animal?
The answer to that is the employee. So the employee who's using the service animal will take care of what the animal needs throughout the day, and is also responsible to supervise the animal at all times. So an employer can expect that the employee will do this and also expect that the animal knows how to behave in the work environment.
Great. So we did have a question from one of our employees about interacting with service animals, and they would like to know, is it okay to pet service dogs at the workplace?
The answer to that is no, and I understand that we all may have that desire to want to pet the animal or to pet the service dog, but this really brings up a good point about how do we interact with the service animal in the workplace. And so the first thing to consider is confidentiality. So it's likely as an employer, you are going to want to let all of your employees know when a service animal is going to be in the work environment and that they are not to interact with the animal in any way. But beyond that, you don't want to disclose that the employee using the service animal has a disability because that is not permitted. And so what you could consider is talking with the employee who is using the service animal to find out what is his comfort level for providing training on proper etiquette to all employees when the service animal is in the environment. Now, the employee may likely benefit from this as well, so that he does not have to deliver that message to his coworkers over and over and over again. And so what this training can address is that service animals are working. They are there to perform important tasks, And so we do not want to pet the service animal or praise the animal or distract the animal in any way, because that will take away from what the animal is there to do.
Thanks, Julie. And speaking of training, I did want to mention, if you are an employer and you're not sure where to find disability etiquette training, please reach out to us at OOD. We can customize the training to the particular needs of your organization, either for the management or coworkers, in person or virtually, and cover many of the topics Julie was referring to. Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit, Julie. With the COVID-19 pandemic and the requirement to wear masks to help prevent the spread, we have received questions about face coverings in the workplace. So an employer asked, what should they do when an employer requests a reasonable accommodation with regard to face coverings?
So Dennis, the EEOC has another wonderful published guidance that's called Pandemic Preparedness in the Workplace. This is not a new guidance, but it has been updated for the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this guidance, it states that an employer may require employees to wear personal protective equipment, which is referred to as PPE. And then it gives examples of PPE, and certainly a face mask or a face covering is one form of PPE. And so in the guidance, it indicates that when an employee with a disability needs a reasonable accommodation regarding PPE, the employer should consider this request for the accommodation unless doing so causes an undue hardship. So when an employee requests a reasonable accommodation regarding the face covering, a best practice really is just to engage in your interactive process as you would with any request for an accommodation.
Perfect. So Julie, one of our employers wants to know if you have any suggestions on some of the accommodations they can consider when an employee with a disability requests a reasonable accommodation with regard to face coverings.
Right, so when you're in that interactive process and you're collaborating with the employee and you're identifying some ideas on how can we accommodate this request, here are some things that you can consider and see if these would work well in your work environment. The first one is to explore the option of whether there are alternative types of facial coverings that could be worn and utilized if it's feasible and if it doesn't cause an undue hardship. You could also consider a modified schedule, and that may permit the employee to take breaks as needed to remove the mask in a private space or outdoors to get fresh air. Another accommodation you could consider is temporary reassignment. And that would permit the employee possibly to work from home remotely in a telework environment or in a position that limits the need to wear the mask. Again, you could consider that private office where the face covering could be removed. And then consider for those times when our work naturally brings us together to communicate, could we instead have that communication in an alternative way, maybe over the phone or through a video call or conference, through chatting or a text message.
Great, and I think we're all kind of using some of those alternative communications in this current environment. So Julie, some of the questions we received were specific to the deaf and hard of hearing employees. We had an employer ask, how people who are deaf or hard of hearing and depend on lip reading are managing. And another asked, how do you handle communicating with someone who is hard of hearing while wearing a mask when they rely on reading lips and your facial expressions?
Right, so when we are all wearing a face covering right now, it does pose a challenge for employees who are deaf and hard of hearing, who rely on reading lips or seeing facial expressions or hearing those clear sounds we make when we're communicating. As a side note, I just want to share that it's a myth that all deaf and hard of hearing employees know how to read lips. This is always case by case, so some people know how to read lips, other people do not. It's also a myth that all deaf and hard of hearing employees are completely deaf. So again, this is case by case, and some people can rely on clear sounds when talking, and so those are being muffled right now by the face coverings, and so that creates another barrier. But there are some ideas that you can consider to see if we can improve and remove this barrier. The first may not be a surprise at this point in the pandemic, but there are clear face masks that are available in the marketplace. And so if you decide to implement these in the work environment, just choose one that has a large enough clear space that you can see the lips, the teeth, and the facial expressions. We have included in the Learner's Guide a link to places where these can be purchased. They did sell out pretty early on in the pandemic, and I'm not sure if they've caught up with demand. So I've also included a resource that shows you how you can make a clear face mask if you have that skill. And then if it works in your work environment, you could consider whether a clear face shield could be worn. Beyond that, we could use some alternative methods of communications for those quick and short conversations. So the first idea is to incorporate gestures and demonstrations into your communications. Even if it feels silly, this added element really is appreciated by people to help convey the message. And that's a good practice whether we're wearing face coverings or not. We could again also consider, could we achieve the goal of this communication through a text message or through email or chatting, maybe through Skype or Microsoft Teams. We also are aware that there are speech-to-text applications in the marketplace like Ava and Otter, and these can be downloaded onto smart devices, and then through artificial intelligence, they hear what is said and translate that into text, and it kind of looks like a text message on a phone, so that might be one possibility. We could go the old-fashioned route and use paper and pencil or a small portable dry erase board in the work environment to exchange quick notes. There is an item out there in the marketplace called the Boogie Board, and it reminds me of the Etch-a-Sketch from my childhood, where you can write a quick note or draw a quick picture, and then you can press a button and it quickly erases and you can use it again. And then one last consideration is you could offer the option of doing a video chat from another room where both employees can remove their mask because they're in separate rooms and then have their conversation through video chat. We want to remember that some deaf and hard of hearing employees are able to speak and communicate, and so this might be a great option. And then through the video chat, they can see those facial expressions, and if they're able to read lips, then they've got that opportunity. So really, just talk with the employee about what would best meet their needs in the situation.
Those are great ideas. I'm sure that our employers are going to find those helpful. I do want to break quickly for our first question and answer section. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, how do you accommodate a service animal at a healthcare facility or a nursing home where residents have allergies, may be afraid of animals, but the position of employee is to provide direct care to the patient?
So that's a great question, and we talk about allergies and fears quite a bit with this topic. And so when that's the situation, first of all, you don't want this to make you feel like you can't accommodate the service animal. So consider, can we accommodate both needs at the same time? When you're talking about using the service animal with an employee that's doing direct care and that patient has the fear or the allergy, you might want to see if there's another accommodation that would work, because some of the accommodations for managing these include keeping people separate from the animal. So you might want to see if there's another accommodation that could work, and that you would want to talk with the employee about, to say, in this one specific scenario working with this patient, is there something we can provide without you using the animal, and then talk through that scenario. In the case where it doesn't involve direct patient care, but you're managing allergies, you can consider if you can use separate office spaces or separate paths of travel. You can increase your cleaning efforts, which I know we're all doing right now anyhow, but also maybe add a HEPA filter to your ventilation system. And so those are some ideas. There are more ideas also in the Learner's Guide for managing allergies and fears.
Great. Okay, next question. And this again with service animals. How do you accommodate a service animal in a sterile environment like food manufacturing?
So, because the ADA Title I doesn't speak directly to this, they don't have guidance on this, but if you are an employer in a certain setting and you have safety requirements that the animal might compromise, it might be a scenario where it's not reasonable to have the service animal on site. And so you would want to look at what are your your health codes or your safety codes, and you certainly have to follow those. So there might be scenarios in certain work settings where you can't have the service animal maybe in every aspect of that building. Maybe the service animal could be used in the office space, but not where you're preparing food. And I'm just sharing those as examples. Again, you'd want to check with what the guidelines tell you that you have to follow, but yes, you might have to navigate that, and it could mean that we have to figure out a different solution for the animal.
Perfect. And then last question, and this is just of clarification, the participant asks, just to clarify, service animals and comfort animals are to be treated the same as far as considering them as a reasonable accommodation?
Correct. So Title I doesn't have a standalone category for any kind of animal. That is different than Titles 2 and 3. Titles 2 and 3 do speak specifically to this topic, and so for the public, you'll want to address those resources. But from an employment standpoint, you would treat service animal, therapy animal, emotional support animal, all the same.
Got it. Perfect. Okay. Getting back into some of the questions that we've had come in. Julie, I know you consult with employers on Title I of the ADA, and we do have some specific questions on this topic from our request for questions. So some of the questions were about the same topic under Title I, and I'd like to go over those. How can an employer make reasonable accommodations? 2, how is it determined if an accommodation is reasonable or not? And 3, what risks are there to an employer who does not provide reasonable accommodations?
Dennis, I think I'm going to answer the last of those 3 questions first. Title I requires covered employers to provide reasonable accommodations unless doing so causes an undue hardship. And so if an employee with a disability feels they have been denied a reasonable accommodation, they may file a charge with the EEOC, who enforces Title I. So one of the risks you run is to have a file charged against you. But on a more positive note, let me share that there is a very informative small business toolkit provided by the Northeast ADA Center. And in that toolkit, they reference a study that reveals 58% of reasonable accommodations are free, and those that were not had a median cost of $500. And these studies also revealed that employees with disabilities have higher performance ratings, are absent less, and stay on the job longer than employees without disabilities. And so these studies really tell us that providing a reasonable accommodation is a good investment. So the risk you run in not providing reasonable accommodation is losing a good employee and incurring those costs of turnover.
Right, so it seems like providing a reasonable accommodation is a good investment. And so how can an employer make a reasonable accommodation?
Well, the way that an employer makes a reasonable accommodation is through engaging in the informal process known as the interactive process. And this is where the employer and the employee who has made the request work together in a collaborative way to identify what is the limitation that's related to the disability that is impacted at work, what is the workplace barrier that's being experienced, and then together identify what are some effective reasonable accommodation solutions that would remove that barrier. And so to do this, some employers do find it beneficial to create a formal process to navigate providing reasonable accommodations. In September, we delivered a training called Navigating the Reasonable Accommodation Process, and in that it does offer some best practices that employers can consider if you do want to create a formal process. And so that resource is archived on our website, but also included in the Learner's Guide.
Great resources. So Julie, an employer asks, how do we determine if an accommodation is reasonable or if it causes an undue hardship?
Yes, that's another common question that we get. An undue hardship is basically something that is just too costly or too difficult to implement in your work environment. When you determine undue hardship, it really is meant to be on a case-by-case basis, and it requires an analysis to arrive at this decision. You may be in the interactive process working with the employee, and together you identify this great solution, but in the back of your mind, you're thinking, gosh, this is going to cost too much, or this is going to be way too difficult to implement. And you could be right, but you can't rely on your opinion. The guidance suggests that we need to go through an analysis to arrive at this decision. So some of the criteria that EEOC provides to help you make that decision include assessing the cost and nature of the accommodation, taking into account your size as an employer, what your financial resources are, how many employees you have, and then what impact will this accommodation have on your operations. And the EEOC also says, let's look at what the net cost is for the accommodation, because there are some outside funding sources that can be considered. And so in the Learner's Guide, we've included 2 different funding guides that you can take a look at to see if there are some opportunities there for outside sources of funding. We also have a link to some tax benefits that you might be eligible for. And then certainly we offer vocational rehabilitation services to Ohioans with disabilities that can be helpful at certain times.
Thanks, Julie. I'm glad you brought up VR and opportunities for Ohioans with disabilities. We have received a couple of questions from employers asking, are there resources if an employee with a disability needs help to maintain employment? And we also received a question, how can I best assist someone with a disability looking for employment? And I just want to make sure everybody out there knows that in both of those scenarios, OOD can help. We offer vocational rehabilitation services for Ohioans with disabilities who either desire to attain or maintain employment. Our services are customized through assessments and one-on-one meetings with professional vocational rehabilitation counselors who can help with things like accommodations, help with training, identifying technology that can help. And so I would just suggest to any employers out there that are working with somebody, an employee with a disability who maybe needs our assistance, just to direct them to go to oodworks.com, and we've done a really good way of just walking them through the process and making it easy for them to get signed up. Okay, so next question, Julie. We were also asked, if I reassign an employee with a disability to a different position with a lower pay rate, do I have to maintain their higher level of pay?
So the answer to this from the EEOC guidance is no, unless you customarily transfer employees without disabilities to lower level positions and maintain their higher level of pay, then you would want to follow that same practice with employees with disabilities. But let's talk about reassignment in general for just a moment. It is known as the reasonable accommodation of last resort, and so it really is intended that the employer and the employee would consider all possible accommodations and rule out that you just can't find one that's reasonable before turning to reassignment. But when you use reassignment, it is intended to be a transition to a vacant position that does have equal pay and equal benefits.
Okay, Julie, so the final question we received on the ADA was a request to please speak on the topic of conducting an ADA self-assessment of the physical workspace and provide any templates or forms that would help in completing the assessment. Oh, wait, and before that, can you answer if an employee has a low performance and reveals a disability but does not request an accommodation, should the manager inform the employee about the accommodation process or just asked if there is something that will help?
So Dennis, performance is a topic we do receive a lot of questions about from employers. So I just want to first say that Title I does not interfere with your right as an employer to create your job's essential functions or to set those productivity expectations. Title I says an employee with a disability must be able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodation. And so the reasonable accommodation should be considered when it's requested, and that might enable the employee to be able to meet those performance expectations that you have. And so when you are addressing low performance, and the employee chooses to disclose at this time that she has a disability and this is related to the low performance, you kind of do two things at the same time. First, you clearly communicate what your performance expectations are, and you can apply any consequences that you apply for all employees that have low performance. And then you can also ask the employee in what way the disability is contributing to the low performance. If the employee during this conversation doesn't specifically ask for reasonable accommodation, then you could ask the employee, what can you do as the employer to help her meet the performance expectations? And the employee may indicate an interest in exploring options, and so then you would continue with the interactive process. If the employee indicates that she does not wish to pursue options, then you could advise her of who to contact if she changes her mind at a later time and does want to explore this further in the future. Either way, I think it's just helpful to know that sometimes an employee's low performance is their first indicator to themselves that their disability is impacting performance.
That's a great point. And now the final question in this section, again, is we received a request. If you could please speak on the topic of conducting an ADA self-assessment of the physical workspace and provide any templates or forms that would help in completing the assessment.
Absolutely. I've had the great opportunity to work with some of our employer partners on this very topic. So we've had employers ask, how do we know if our work environment is accessible? And if it's not, we want to know that so we can make some changes. And so let me first say again, from the Title I perspective, you're not required to make existing facilities accessible unless you receive a request for a reasonable accommodation to do so. But many employers we know want to be proactive. And so if you want to assess your work environment from a general perspective, there is a checklist that was created by the New England ADA Center, and it's based on the 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design, which are known as the standards. These come from the Department of Justice, and they apply to Titles 2 and 3 of the ADA. And so this is when the public is coming into your space. But this is a great place to start if, as an employer, you just want to assess from a general perspective. Just know that what an applicant or an employee with a disability needs for physical accessibility of the built environment could be greater than what the minimum requirements are that are indicated in the standards.
That makes sense. And it's helpful to know that there's a checklist. So Julie, I know reasonable accommodations is another area where you consult with employers, and we did receive several questions on this topic. Some of these were specific to COVID-19, so let's start with those. Our first question is, what are some best practices for COVID-19 related accommodations?
Right, so let's talk about that pandemic preparedness guidance again. It indicates that Title I is still enforced during the COVID-19 pandemic, but the guidance does tell us that Title I does not interfere with or prevent an employer from following any guidance from your state or your local public health authorities or from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is the CDC. So really the best practice is to follow your own interactive process as you normally do. Now there may be a few things you want to keep in mind that could be unique to the pandemic. So the first one is, and this was happening early in the pandemic, when an employer is in the interactive process and is permitted to obtain medical documentation, they were finding it was taking a while to get that documentation back. And so some employers chose to forego getting the documentation because we know it's not required. You're just permitted under certain situations to do so, and then to continue on with their process of providing an accommodation. Another consideration some employers have made during the COVID-19 pandemic is to offer accommodations on a temporary basis because the pandemic is hopefully going to be temporary. One thing you may want to consider is just to document your decisions when you're doing things differently during your interactive process right now. So if you customarily obtain documentation for those disabilities that are not obvious or invisible, but you're not doing that right now because there's a delay in getting that back, just indicate why you're doing that. or if you implement an accommodation on a temporary basis, put in writing, when is this going to start? When is the accommodation going to end? That could be when the pandemic ends. It could be when you return employees to the work environment. And make sure to include a written agreement with the employee so the employee also understands that this is temporary, when it will start, when it will stop, and then if it stops being effective, who can I call to say we need to evaluate this again?
Right, that makes sense. So, Julie, one of our employers has asked, how has increased work from home due to COVID-19 affected with people with disabilities? Are there advantages or disadvantages, and how can employers help?
Right, so during the pandemic, a lot of employers did shift their employees to a remote working environment from home. And how that impacted all employees is unique to each person. And certainly we have learned since the pandemic started that sometimes the remote environment is more accessible for employees with disabilities. And so let me just share a few of those examples. It's been determined that working from home may alleviate the time, the effort, and the stress that come with getting ready for work and commuting to the workplace. An employee with a disability might also have more flexibility to design their workstation in a way that is more accessible for him or her. And then if the employee is permitted to work a flexible schedule, then the employee is finding working at certain times when her energy levels are most optimal is more preferable, and that's another advantage.
Great point, Julie. I know from a personal perspective, a few years ago, I was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, which people probably know is characterized with periods of distractibility, but also periods of hyperfocus. Being able to work on projects early in the morning when I'm most able to focus has been an unexpected advantage from working at home and has really increased my productivity.
That's great, Dennis. I appreciate you sharing that with us. And so we also know that remote work can create some barriers for employees with disabilities too. And so let's talk through some of those. Due to the pandemic or this quick shift to working remotely and being more isolated, it's certainly the case that certain mental health disabilities could be exacerbated and made worse. And so an employee with a disability might find that they're having difficulty handling these changes to daily routines and activities. And so when that's the case and the employee reaches out with a request for a change in the remote work environment, you would just engage in the interactive process as you would with any request for a reasonable accommodation. And I'll just share a couple of ideas of what an accommodation could look like in the remote work environment. The first one is offering a flexible break schedule so the employee can take a break as needed to manage any symptoms or stress or anxiety being experienced. And that could be just a break to go outside and get some fresh air, or a break to participate in a mindfulness exercise through an application on a smart device. So this could be a mini meditation or a breathing exercise. And then another barrier in the work environment could be all of the background noise from delivery trucks or dogs barking outside, or maybe there's more people working in the home or having school in the home and the home environment is loud. And so this distracts the employee from being able to focus on work. So you could consider a noise canceling device like noise canceling earbuds to see if that could remove that barrier and the employee can focus on work again. So those are just some ideas.
Great ideas. So Julie, one of the employers asks, now that we have employees working from home where we are not there to monitor, how can we effectively evaluate the remote work environment to determine an effective, reasonable accommodation?
So this really speaks to physical disabilities and kind of organizing the workstation, the computer setup. And you're right, on site in the work environment, we could just go to the employee's office and see what the barrier is and begin to troubleshoot for some ideas. But in the remote environment, we can't do that. So here are some ideas that you could consider. First, as you would anyway in your interactive process, you can ask the employee questions to identify, what is the limitation you're experiencing at work due to your disability? And then what is the barrier in your work environment at home? And then what ideas do you have to remove this barrier so you can perform your job? The employee likely has an idea in mind, so it's important to ask. If both of you are not able to really identify what the barrier is or the solution, which oftentimes can happen, you could ask the employee to complete a self-assessment of the workstation. Or if you are able to find a vendor who has shifted to providing virtual assessments of the workstation, that could be helpful also in identifying barriers and finding solutions. And so from a self-assessment perspective, we have included some resources in the Learner's Guide. The first one is from the Ohio Bureau of Workers' Compensation. On their website, they have some ergonomic tools and resources. This includes a computer workstation needs assessment. They also have a computer setup checklist and some positioning tips for the workstation. And then similarly, we've included a resource from OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. They have similar resources on their website as well.
Those are great tips for remote workers. We do have an employer that has asked what types of accommodations may be needed for employees with disabilities in the on-site COVID-19 work environment.
So that's a good question too. Early on in the pandemic, a lot of employers sent employees home, but some employers couldn't do that because work couldn't be performed in a remote way. And so some employers figured this out pretty quickly, and then other employers are bringing back employees in different phases. And so whatever phase you're in, when you bring your employees back, you're likely bringing them back to an environment that is a little bit different. Maybe it's marked for social distancing. And so we just have some ideas for you to consider. The first one is if you do have a work environment where you are putting markings on the floor to indicate physical distancing, consider using high contrast colors. And if it's safe, put some texture to those markers because this can be helpful for employees with low vision. You can also consider providing orientation and mobility training that can help a blind or low vision employee to become familiar with any changes that you've made in the work environment and to identify those markers for social distancing that you may have implemented. And then one final idea is it's likely that you are going to be providing training for all of your employees on all of these new safety procedures that you have, the proper use of whatever PPE you're using in your work environment, and then how you're sanitizing. What are your protocols for all of these things? And you want to make sure that communication is delivered in an accessible format. So earlier in the pandemic, we did provide a webinar titled Supporting Employees with Disabilities During COVID-19. And in that training, we discussed some best practices for communicating this kind of information with employees with disabilities.
Great tips. So Julie, we did have some general questions about reasonable accommodations. One of our employers asked, what innovations are you seeing out there at different employers around the country? And another asked if you had suggestions of accommodations for different scenarios.
So I think this is a good time to talk about the barriers that exist in the virtual environment. Certainly we access the virtual environment on site in the work environment, but also from the remote environment. And it can pose some barriers. So let's first talk about employees who are blind or low vision. They may face barriers when they're accessing documents and working collaboratively in the virtual environment or participating in video calls or video conferences. And then a lot of employers are interviewing virtually now too, and all of these can provide some barriers. So the first idea is you're likely using a virtual platform, and so determine if that platform is accessible, and specifically, is it compatible with assistive technology like a screen reader or magnification software. And then when you do have accessibility constraints with that virtual environment, identify if you can consider as an accommodation having the conversation over the phone instead and see if that achieves the goal of the communication. And then certainly any documents that you're sharing in the virtual environment, you want to make sure these are accessible and that these can be read by a screen reader. So the Microsoft Office suite of products like Word, Excel, and Outlook have an accessibility checker built in that you can use. And then we've provided a resource in the Learner's Guide from the state of Minnesota that offers instructions on how to create accessible documents for these formats like Word and PowerPoint as well.
Great. So Julie, you were probably going to address this anyway, but we did have a specific question asking, how are deaf employees who depend on lip reading managing in the remote work environment? And also, what are some examples of technology that can support communication with deaf employees?
Yes, you're right. I did want to talk about this because deaf and hard of hearing employees certainly face barriers in the virtual environment, again, whether it's remote or on site. And this can be when communicating through phone calls or video calls, or participating in trainings or meetings that happen through video conference, and then again with virtual interviews. And so here are some ideas. You could consider a video relay service, which is a form of telecommunications that enables deaf and hard of hearing individuals who use American Sign Language to communicate with voice telephone users. This is a free public service. It works through the use of video equipment, a communications assistant, and a phone line or an internet connection. And so for more information on what that is and how to get that set up, we do have resources in the Learner's Guide for the Federal Communications Commission and also for Ohio Relay. As an alternative to a phone call, you could determine with the employee if you could communicate effectively through an email or sending a chat through Skype or Microsoft Teams instead. For those times when you need to have a sign language interpreter in the virtual platform, it's important that that platform supports a third-party participant, and if it doesn't, you might consider switching to a platform that does, like Zoom. And then another option that we're all familiar with is captioning, and there are two ways really to provide that. One is through artificial intelligence, which we call AI, and another is live captioning. So what's important to know about AI captioning, it's built into several different virtual platforms and it can be very beneficial, and the technology is improving, but just be aware that it's not perfect. It can make errors in punctuation and spelling, and that can cause confusion. So there are definitely times when it's more appropriate to use the live captioning, which you may know as Communication Access Real Time, or CART for short. And this is where a trained stenographer translates what is said into real-time text that is then displayed on the computer or smart device. And certainly this can be provided remotely. So again, you just want to check that your virtual platform would support remote CART. If you are wondering what is the best kind of captioning to use, it's really between you and the employee to discuss that and discuss the different options during your interactive process. And then in the Learner's Guide, we have provided resources that do discuss in more depth the pros and cons of automatic captioning versus live captioning. And then we have some articles that help you compare the accessibility features of the different virtual platforms.
Great. So Julie, you mentioned sign language interpreters as a form of reasonable accommodation. And we did receive this question from an employer, and they ask, if I hire a person who is deaf, will they always need a sign language interpreter?
Generally, the answer to that is no. We find sign language interpreters are really beneficial for communications such as interviews and trainings and presentations. But for some of those day-to-day quick communications that we have, there are some other low-tech options that you could consider, such as those speech-to-text applications we mentioned earlier that you can have on your smart devices, exchanging those quick notes, whether it's the boogie board or paper and pencil, and then using text between our mobile phones. It's really just important to remember to collaborate with the employee to determine what is the effective, reasonable accommodation for the type of communication that you're having.
Great. So we're fortunate in our roles that we work with employers who want to expand their hiring pools to include candidates with disabilities and create diverse and inclusive work environments. And we sometimes, and we know this sometimes comes with questions about best practices to achieve this goal. We did receive a question from an employer asking, who are the leaders around accessibility and how do I know if our company is inclusive?
Dennis, there's a nonprofit organization known as Disability In that offers many services and resources for employers. And on their website, they have a series of documents that offer best practices for disability inclusion in the workplace. And these best practices are from those employers who have top scores on the Disability Equality Index, which is known as the DEI. And so the DEI is one example of a benchmarking tool that you can use to gauge how your disability inclusion efforts compare with that of other companies. And the questions from the DEI are available for you if you want to review those and answer those for yourself. For additional best practices and ways to measure your efforts and reassess how you're doing, you can reference the Employer Assistance and Resource Network on disability inclusion. This is referred to as EARN. And then there's also a disability employment tracker from the National Organization on Disability. And so all of these resources are in the Learner's Guide, and they really offer employers ways to become more inclusive of employees with disabilities. So that could include, encouraging self-identification in the workplace, or making sure that you're recruiting from sources that include qualified candidates with disabilities, such as partnering with us here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities. It could also address making efforts to retain the qualified employees with disabilities that you already have, and then making sure to measure the effectiveness of all of your practices.
Great. So it sounds like there are some excellent resources available for an employer to determine how they're doing with creating inclusive work environments. I do want to stop now and ask a final time and go through some of the questions that we did receive. The first one came in a little late, was from the first section, and they ask, if one employee has a service animal and another has a phobia, which trumps the other?
That's a great question, and neither trumps the other. What you do is really engage in the interactive process with both to see if you can work this out, right? So there's some strategies that you could consider where maybe we could reduce the interaction or eliminate the interaction of these two employees. And that could be separate work areas. This could be that you designate different paths of travel in the workplace. So maybe there's one main path that we know the animal is going to only be permitted to navigate, and so the employee with the phobia knows all other paths of travel. I will not encounter the animal here. For those areas where you have shared spaces like a break room or a lunch room, you could alter schedules. So maybe break schedules and lunch schedules are offset so these employees don't encounter each other. And then if these two employees work together like you and I do, Dennis, there are times we in the past would naturally come together and meet in each other's office, or we'd have a group meeting and we'd all come together. Sure. We could consider if that kind of communication really could occur in another way. So now you and I are communicating through video conference. So would that be an option for these employees too? And when it's not, you could always ask the employee who's using the service animal, for this one meeting that we're having as a group, is there another accommodation that would work with leaving maybe the animal in your private office? And if it's not, that's okay, but it's something you could talk through to find out if it's an option.
Great. Next question. When during the interactive process can you request medical documentation for the reasonable accommodation request?
That's another great question. I think these are all great questions. So when you're in the interactive process, you are permitted to obtain medical documentation when either the disability itself is not obvious, or what is referred to as invisible, or if the need for the accommodation itself is not obvious. So in those two times, then you are permitted. You're not required to get documentation, but you are permitted to.
Perfect. Okay. Next question. How do I deal with an employee who refuses to speak to me during the interactive process and instead works through a third party, such as their union?
When it comes to the union, you want to just follow the rules of your interactive process, and you are permitted to ask questions. And then if the employee wants union representation or wants the union to speak on their behalf, then that reflects the rules of the union. And you'd really, I don't want to speak to each different union that's out there. So you'd want to, that's kind of a case-by-case situation. Sure. To understand what are the rules of the union.
Perfect. Next question. Can you talk about accommodations? I think it's for an employee with anxiety, ADD, etc. It says for EEs with an anxiety, ADD, or etc.
So, I mean, accommodations are always case by case and what a person needs. We know that no two people with the same diagnosis experience that diagnosis in the same way. Each job is different. So this really is case by case, but just some general examples of accommodations for these types of diagnoses. Could be a flexible schedule, as we mentioned earlier, to take a break as needed to manage these accommodations. Some of these diagnoses you mentioned can impact our cognition or our thinking, and so maybe I communicate better through an email. So for example, I have a supervisor, and she and I talk about my work, and so maybe altering her supervisory method could be helpful if I receive information better in a written format, and so she could send me emails instead of having face-to-face meetings. Or maybe it would be helpful for me if we met more often than just once a week to kind of go over the priority of my tasks. And so sometimes just rearranging work or how we communicate can be forms of reasonable accommodation. And then just another one that comes to mind is sometimes with the diagnoses that you mentioned, there can be distractions in the work environment, whether they're visual or auditory. So we mentioned those noise canceling headsets earlier. In the work environment, you can have private offices or put up partitions to block out some visual distractions so you're better able to focus on work. So those are just some quick ideas, and I'd be happy to talk offline in more depth about those if that's helpful.
Great, thanks, Julie. We had more questions than unfortunately that we have time for. So that's all the time that we do have. We just have a few minutes left to wrap up our first accessibility hour with OOD.
Well, thank you, Dennis. I certainly want to thank all of you who are attending today. We really appreciate your continued interest in this topic of worksite accessibility. Some of you took the time to submit questions in advance, and then some of you asked live questions today, and we certainly appreciate that. Again, you have our contact information, so if we're closing this out today and you still have some questions, absolutely reach out to Dennis and I, and we are happy to answer those questions. On that note, it has been my pleasure to share this time with you, and Dennis, it's always great to present with you, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie.